Shalom. Today I'd like to talk to you about the holiday of Purim. Megillat Esther opens up and tells us, Vayibi me Achashverosh, it was in the time of Achashverosh, the king, in his third year, that he made this, what we would call a massive party hardy for some 180 days. Now, it seems strange that the story of Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, starts off in the third year of Achashverosh. In fact, we don't find that in any other books. Books usually start at the beginning of the story. Here, it seems that for some reason we're in the midst of this story over here, and it was the third year of Achashverosh. We don't know exactly what happened before. In order to understand the entire picture of Purim and its relevance to today, we must first understand the global picture, exactly what was happening over here. If we just look at the Tzimtzum, the smaller side of the tale, we see that he had a party, the story of Haman, etc. We sought to be missing out of the whole picture. It's very important to see the whole picture in order to understand exactly what Purim is all about. In understanding that, we know that we're going to go back a few years before Purim in the history of the Jewish people, when they were still settling in the land of Eretz Yisrael. In fact, the Beis HaMikdash was standing for over 400 years. There were two kingdoms since the time of Shlomo HaMelech, the kingdom of Israel, the kingdom of Judah. And after this long period of time, some 850 years since the time that Yoshua ben Nun entered with the Jewish people into the land of Israel, conquered the land, and they settled the land. 850 years have passed at this time. And comes along on the player field is Sancheriv, the king of Ashur, up there, up north from the kingdom of Israel. And he comes and he destroys the entire house of the kingdom of Israel, sending the 10 tribes into exile. Now, part of his philosophy was to uproot nations from place to place, take the nation that was living in Africa and move them to Europe. The people who lived in Europe, uproot them and bring them to Egypt, etc., to move the entire world around. And he thought in his philosophy that this way the people would not rebel against him. So he uprooted and sent to exile the 10 tribes who lived at the time in the kingdom of Israel, and he brought some other people over, which are now being known as the Shomronim, the people who settled in Samaria. If you look in the book of Kings, you could see that Sancheriv brings these people in, and there's a plague, and they're settling in this part of the land itself. But during this period of time, Sancheriv is unable to attack the city of Yerushalayim and to totally conquer Eretz Yisrael, and he is removed from the scene. In the meantime, the kings of Judah continue to range in this area until we have a new king in the playing field, and that is Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And if you look over here on chapter 24, in the book of Kings 2, it tells us that in these days, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, invaded. He invaded into the land of Eretz Yisrael. And if you read the text carefully, in this chapter and the next one, you find something very interesting. Nebuchadnezzar just didn't come in and destroy Yerushalayim and the Beis HaMikdash, but it was actually a series of stages that he came into Yerushalayim. First, he removed the noblemen, then he removed the vessels from the Beis HaMikdash. He placed a king, a vassal state, in order to work for him, Sidkiyahu, and he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar finally came years later and destroyed the entire city of Yerushalayim, including the Beis HaMikdash, sending everyone out to exile, or almost everybody. That took place in the year 3,338 from the beginning of creation. So it's important to note what we have over here. This is a history and we get to see, when we look at the history, we step back a little bit from the story of Purim, we're able to see the entire picture a lot clearer and a lot better, exactly what was going on at that particular time. The Jewish people are now led to exile into Babylon. The kings of Babylon ruled for some 70 years. There was 3 generations of the kings of Babylon. They were Nebuchadnezzar, his son Evil Modach, who ruled for 23 years. Nebuchadnezzar ruled for 44 years, and Balthazar, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, ruled for 3 years. After that time, the kingdom was conquered by Persia, Koresh. Well, if we look in the book of Ezra, we find that he decrees that the Jewish people can now go back to the land of Eretz Israel. But a little bit before that, while we still have the kings of Babylon up over here, we said that Balthazar was the last king of Babel, of the Babylonian Empire, and he ruled for 3 years. Now, at the end of this 3-year period, he made a big party. Just like Achashverosh is celebrating in our story of Esther, Belshazzar also made a big party. And what he did was that he took out the vessels that were taken originally from his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar from Yerushalayim, and he brought them out, and he partied with them. He used them. Why would he do such a thing? And the answer is very simple. The non-Jewish world was aware that the prophet Jeremiah had prophesied that after 70 years the Jewish people would return to the land of Eretz Israel. Now they did their calculations. Balthazar did his calculations. Afterwards we'll find out that Achashverosh did a calculation of exactly when these 70 years were up. And they were very interested in finding that the 70 years are up, and here the Jewish people have not returned to the land of Eretz Israel, and they have not rebuilt their Beis HaMikdash. They were very happy about this fact. So Balthazar made an account to the 70 years. He was mistaken with his account. But in any case, he took out the vessels. According to him, the 70 years had transpired. And the Beis HaMikdash, the temple of the Jews, was not rebuilt. The Jews have not returned in force. And so he partied. He took out the vessels. That very night, because he misused the holy vessels of the Beis HaMikdash, he was put to death. And the Persian Empire rose in the ashes of the Babylonians. Koresh becomes king, and in that same year, 3390, he has his famous declaration, which is listed in the book of Ezra, as I mentioned, and that is, he allows the Jewish people to return to the land of Eretz Israel. Unfortunately, not many of the Jews, or the great majority, prefer to stay in Babylon, where they had houses built by then, and they had good businesses running, the golden age of the Babylonian exile. Oh yes, wonderful times for the Jews. Only some 42,000 Jews return, the lowlife, the lowest on the total poll of society. The big rabbis, they all stayed in Babylon. And they said, who is Koresh? Who is Koresh to give us permission, this non-Jew, to give us permission to return to the land of Eretz Israel? So they did not return, and they stayed in Babylon. But permission was granted. One of the people who do return at that time is none other but our hero from the story of Purim, Mordechai. Mordechai HaYehudi. In fact, he was one of the noble people, because he comes from the house of Shaul, who was the king. He's one of the noblemen who was first exiled in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, one of the stages of the exiles that we had over here. So he was placed into exile, and now he's an older man, and now he comes back to Eretz Israel when permission is granted. All the people who had a little seichel realized, hey, the doors are open for Eretz Israel, let's go now and take advantage of that, make Aliyah and come back. If you look in the book of Ezra, the 2nd chapter, the 2nd sentence, there you will find the name Mordechai listed as one of the people who returned to the land of Eretz Yisrael. Now, a year later from that event, in the year 3392, from Briat HaOlam, from creation, Achashverosh becomes king. Achashverosh becomes king, inherits the kingdom, even though there's a big story about that, exactly how he was able to do it, but that's not part of our story right now, so we're going to just leave that on the side. In any case, at this particular year, he he becomes king. You would think that at this particular point in time, which usually occurs with leaders who are elected or become powerful, that's the time for them to make the heavy-do party. But we see that the party did not take place except for 3 years later down the cour. Now, a year later, in the year 3393, even though the Jews had returned from Koresh a number of years earlier, some 3 years before, they actually, right now, at this time, they started to rebuild the foundations of the Beis Hamikdash. Meaning that when they came back to Eretz Yisrael, everything is obviously destroyed from Nebuchadnezzar. They went up to the Temple Mount, they started to clean up the mess that was over there, and they built an altar. An altar was going continuously during this period of time. But there was no building itself of the Beis Hamikdash. Now was the time to start the building of the Beis Hamikdash. What happens here is that the people who were brought over, what we call the Shomronim, if you recall what I mentioned earlier, that Sanchariv had uprooted civilizations, peoples, and brought them from different places. So they have been living in Samaria, in the area of Samaria, for quite a while already, and they were very much opposed to this building of the Beis Hamikdash. At first, they come to Ezra and Nehemiah and they say, "Hey, let's build this together." When that is rejected outhand, that it's lo lanu v'lo lachem livnot bayit l'Hashem, it's not for me and for you to build houses, it's just for us. So they became our great enemies. And throughout the entire history of the second Beis Hamikdash, the Shomronim were a great enemy and caused tremendous troubles to the Jewish people. They send a letter to Achashverosh, telling them that this is not a good idea, that the Jews are going to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. It has a history of they're going to rebel against you, against the throne. They have a long history about that, and you must stop it right away. That same year, which we find over here also in the book of Ezra, the 4th chapter, that same year, Achashverosh puts a Sav Hafsaka Avodah. Meaning, what does he do over here, Achashverosh? He says, he gets this letter from the Shomronim, these people that the Jews are rebuilding the Beis Hamikdash, and it's not a good thing. Of course, he doesn't like Jews anyway. So he finds that he gets this letter over here. He says, well, we'll have to investigate. We'll form a committee. We'll put it off. In the meantime, no work could be done until we make a final decision over here. Actually, it's interesting to note that all this really came about because of Vashti, Achashverosh's wife, Queen Vashti, who told Achashverosh she hated the Jews even more. She was the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and she says, "My grandfather destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, and now you're allowing them to rebuild it? That doesn't make sense." At that very moment, a decree was placed in heaven that she had to be killed because of her evilness. Now we come to the party, which is what actually the Megillah opens up with the 3rd year of Achashverosh, and he's making this big party, and that took place in the year 3395. He has this big party, and what exactly is Achashverosh celebrating at this particular point? Achashverosh is celebrating, according to his calculations, the 70 years that have passed. Yirmiyahu's prophecy, Jeremiah's prophecy, has not been fulfilled. And he's happy as could be, because the Jews are not going to be redeemed. That shows that they're not the chosen people. There's been a mistake, as God has left them. And he makes this massive party for over 180 days. Just a crazy party, especially in Shushan, and everyone's getting drunk all the time. And of course we know during that party that Vashti is put to death. Now, it's interesting to note that the Jews themselves were taking part of this party. So how absurd is this? That here you have this party celebrating the prophecy not being fulfilled, and Achashverosh is taking out the vessels once again of the Beis Hamikdash. He's dressing up himself as the Kohen Gadol, and the Jews are partaking of this celebration of not having their own homeland and not rebuilding the Beis Hamikdash. Now, what happens over here is that when the Sav Hafsaka, when the order comes in from Achashverosh to stop working in the Beis Hamikdash, the Jews get together and they have a plan. Say, what can we do now? We must send an envoy over to Persia, to Achashverosh, and to plead our case in front of him and try to get him to back off of this order and to allow us to continue the work of building the Beis Hamikdash. So the Jews look around and say, who is the best person who we could send to Achashverosh to plead the case of the Jews? Well, it's none other than Mordechai, our hero of the story. So we remember that Mordechai was one of the noblemen. He was a boy at the time who was exiled in the time of Nebuchadnezzar to Babylon. He came back in the time of Ezra, and now they're sending him back again to Persia to plead the case for the Jewish people. Well, the Shomronim hear about this, and they figure, well, if they're sending people over to plead the case, we must also send over somebody who could plead the case against the Jews not to build the Beis Hamikdash. So they get involved in a committee, and they say, who could we send? And they decide on none other than our evil man, Haman himself. Haman, who we'll find out in the story of the Megillah, comes up on the scene, but actually people really don't realize that he actually was one of the Shomronim, one of the people that lived in Samaria, in Eretz Yisrael, and he was sent on his mission to go to Achashverosh. Both of them traveled together in the same ship. It's a long story over there. We won't go into that right now. And both of them get off and embark in Persia. And Mordechai comes and he's about to plead the case for the Jews that they should rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. And what does he find out when he gets there? Everyone's partying. Hey, what's going on? He also likes a good party. Mordechai likes a good party. Sure, why not? What's the party about? Well, the party is about that there's no Beis Hamikdash. Time is up. Yirmiyahu's prophecy didn't come true. So you can't believe it. His whole mission is to come, and here the Jews themselves are partaking of this particular party that's going on over here. In any case, to make a long story short, in the year 3394, which is some 4 years after this celebration, Esther and Achashverosh wed. Nice couple. Beautiful couple. A year later, they have a child. And their child's name is Diryavesh. Diryavesh, halachically, according to Jewish law, he's Jewish because he's the child of Esther. Diryavesh II. And that took place in the 8th year of Achashverosh's rule. We move forward now 4 years later, 12 years into the rule of Achashverosh, which was the year 3404. Haman comes on the scene. He moves up. Since he came from Samaria, over the years he's moved up the company ladder, so to speak, and now he's the man in command, and he makes his lottery at this particular point in time. And that, of course, was Yud Gimel B'Nisan. Yud Gimel B'Nisan is 2 days before Pesach, and the decree is made on that particular day that in the following year, 11 months from now, will be the time in Adar, because it's Nisan is the first month, Adar is the last month, so you still have 11 months to go. And he said, in 11 months from now, we will go and kill all the Jews. In the meantime, he sends out the letters to all he takes the king's ring and he seals in it, etc. That particular time, on that very day, when he hears about it, Mordechai hears about it. It's still Yud Gimel B'Nisan. Mordechai yells and cries out, and wears garments and cuts his garments and mourns over the horrible decree. That same day, there's a vikuach, a discussion between Esther and Mordechai exactly how to go about and save the Jewish people. She sends him clothing, he refuses the clothing, etc. And then she decides on a strategy that for the next 3 days we should have a fast, which comes out to Yudalid, Tetvav, and Tetzayin, which is the day before Pesach, the day of Pesach, and the day after Pesach. And those are the 3 days that we have a fast on. So that particular year, nobody ate matzah, nobody fulfilled the commandments of Pesach. Everybody was fasting for three full days. There was no Pesach in Shushan during that year. On Tet Zayin, on the 16th of Nisan, Esther makes a party just for Achashverosh and Haman. We're all familiar with the story and the particulars. The next day, on Yud Zayin B'Nisan, Achashverosh can't sleep. His books are brought before him, and he sees that a favor has not been returned to Mordechai for saving his life. And then the next day, on Yud Zayin B'Nisan, the 17th of Nisan, is the end and the destruction of Haman with the second party that Esther made in her state. Now, during this period of time, we know that the end of Haman, his whole family was hung, etc. This took place in Nisan, but the Jews prepared themselves only for the big decree, which was going to be 11 months later. And it's interesting that Achashverosh, who plays a part over here, like, oh, look at me, I'm really a goody-goody. It's interesting that he never withdrew this original decree of killing the Jews. The only thing that he did was to give permission for the Jews to stand on themselves and to defend themselves. During this period of time, Mordechai, who now became Mishneh L'Melech, the second in command, went from place to place, village to village, encouraging the Jews and getting their defense ready. So when the day did arrive, Purim in Adar, the Jews were ready and they were able to wipe out their enemies. Now it's interesting that what happens after this event. Achashverosh, in the year 3406, passes away. Basically, he ruled for 13 years. So all of this took place in the 12th year with Purim, etc. And immediately he's out of the playing field because he's gone. We don't need him anymore. He's a king. He's probably eating a lot of cholesterol, fats, no good. So he has a massive heart attack and he dies. Who becomes the king at this particular point in time? None other than Daryavesh, his son. Daryavesh, his son, is a small child. He's only 6 years old at this particular time. But who's really running the show behind him? He's only 6 years old. Who's running the show? Uncle Mordechai and Queen Esther. So 2 years later, when he's 8, at the year 3408, they go over to him and say, look, there is this matter that we have in Jerusalem about the Jews over here, that they want to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. We think you should sign the form allowing them to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. They promise him some candy. He's only 8 years old. He signs the form, the documents, and the Jews are able once again to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. Interesting to note that that took place in the year 3408, when the Beis Hamikdash was being rebuilt. And if you make your calculations from the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash until this time, it comes out exactly to 70 years. So we see that throughout the ages, everybody was waiting and anticipating to see when will Yirmiyahu's prophecy be fulfilled, if it will be fulfilled at all. The nations were very happy that it wasn't being fulfilled according to their opinion, but we know that they had made a mistake in the calculations. But it works out exactly that 70 years from the time of the destruction, because we mentioned that there were stages of Nebuchadnezzar's entering into Yerushalayim. He just didn't destroy the Beis Hamikdash. He first exiled the noblemen. Then he took the vessels of the Beis Hamikdash. So there were many 70-year combinations. But when you look at it from the destruction until the rebuilding, it is exactly 70 years. And this Jewish child, Daryavesh II, gave the command for the Jewish people to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. It comes out from our story over here. When you see the entire picture of the Megillat Esther, the Jews, unfortunately, were comfortable in Persia, in Shushan. They were happy there. They were participating of the celebration. The Migdash, the temple in Yerushalayim, not for us. You stay in your Yerushalayim, they said to Mordechai. We'll stay in our small Yerushalayim. And they were happy there in the exiles. They didn't have any initiative to build the Beis Hamikdash. Comes along God and says, no, this is not right. My dwelling place is in Yerushalayim. I want all the Jews to go to Yerushalayim. The Jews don't want to pick themselves up. He brings this trouble of Haman and the horrible decree of trying to wipe out the Jews. That's at the center of the entire story of Purim. The center is that when you don't do what you have to do, and that is for the Jewish people to come home to Eretz Yisrael and to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, when you don't do it, God has many messages, and He could cause in the big playing field many different story likes in order to awaken the Jewish people and to make sure that we really do get back home and rebuild the Beis Hamikdash. I'm Levi Chazan, coming to you from Yerushalayim. That is the authentic story of Purim.